Magic time. How are we, everyone? Great. Thank you for carving some time out of this beautiful afternoon to hang out in our community room. My name is Mallory Aarons. I'm the head of adult programming here at Darien Library. It's my great honor to welcome you here this afternoon. Programs at the library, for those of you that are new, are made possible by our annual contributions to the Friends of the Library campaign. Every event that happens here in this space, every book on the shelf, every computer we have is because of private donations. So thank you to the Friends of Darien Library. Today's guest is not new to the library, and we're happy to welcome him back. He's retired from a 30-year career as an underwriter for a leading land title insurance company. Okay, what does that have to do with history? Good question. He's been involved in American Revolutionary War living history since 1974. He's portrayed infantry, light infantry, whaleboat rider, and mounted and dismounted dragoons. His artistic endeavors included writing and recording a comedy CD, and decades as a musician playing saxes in area rock and roll and blues bands. To his credit or shame, he had his likeness used in an issue of Mad magazine. Eric is enjoying retirement with his wife Catherine, taking classes, giving lectures on historical topics, and continuing to live history. Please join me in welcoming back to the library Eric Chandler. You're welcome. Have fun.
Okay. Stick around. Everybody's cell phones off? Okay, you don't want to piss off George. Okay, so women in the American Revolution, putting the her in heroics. So when I first started putting this talk together, the big decision is where to start. Which of the individuals should have the prestige of being the first presented? And I decided really to start with the most ubiquitous, least understood, and probably most maligned, the camp followers, or as they were known, the women of the camp. Now the images here, some are drawings by an historic artist by the name of Don Troiani. He's local to the area. He is quite well known for his historic art. The two center pictures are women portraying women in an 18th century camp at a reenactment. The woman on the far left is also portraying a woman in the camp at a reenactment. She's really a little overdressed for the activity. In all honesty, the most accurate would be the artist's renderings of what the women would have looked like, and yes, oftentimes they had their children with them. They were not there for purposes of prostitution, which has been the common view in later years. Let's face it, the soldiers were poorly paid if they were paid at all. Oftentimes their pay would be called stopped for damages. If they lost equipment, damaged equipment, their pay would be docked to reimburse the regiment. So they did not have the money to spend on frivolities such as women of easy virtue. Now, both sides had them. They followed the American camp. The British brought their camp women with them, wives, girlfriends, or women that attached themselves to the army along the way, as did the Hessians. Even George Washington needed the comfort of his wife as a woman of the camp, as was the term of art then, to ease his fevered brow and calm him down from having to deal with Congress. Congress was no easier to deal with then than it is today. Let me go back. Washington was concerned that the women who attached themselves to the army, be it wives, girlfriends, or women who saw this as an opportunity to make money as seamstresses, as laundresses, doing the fatigue duties that the soldiers didn't necessarily want to do, gathering wood and water, cooking for the soldiers. They drew rations from the commissary, as the soldiers did. Washington wanted to make sure that the drain on the resources going to these women and their children was returned in value in some way. Now, being a woman of the camp was not necessarily a safe activity. 1791, we're talking 15 years after the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And the reason I say that is because of General St. Clair. General St. Clair, in 1776, led the wing of the army that took out the Hessian barracks in Trenton. Now, 15 years later, he is both a civilian and military governor of the Ohio Territory. Believe it or not, the Native Americans took great offense at the intrusion of white settlers into what had been traditionally their living and hunting grounds. And so they were known to attack settlers and cause great harm to the military forces that were sent after them. In his capacity as military and civilian governor of the Ohio Territory, General St. Clair led a body of some 1,000 to 1,200 men, plus 1,200 women of the camp and their children, up the Wabash in western Ohio. On the night of November 3rd, 1791, with all the hubris of white guys chasing red guys, the militia decided, well, we don't really need to set up any protections for the camp, and we don't really need to set out a lot of sentries. So on the morning of November 4th, come dawn, they got a very rude wake-up call. Before the day was over, 97% of the troops and almost all 200 of the women were either killed or captured. St. Clair returned to his headquarters with very few men, and it was a severe lesson for the American Army. So one of the ways that women proved their worth was to serve as nurses. They helped to fight camp diseases, they treated fevers, they treated wounds, and here we have an image of women nursing fallen militiamen who in all likelihood were family members or friends of family members. One woman who served as a nurse was Abigail Rice. She and her family came from Europe in 1750 when she was 8 years of age. As you can see from the lower left-hand corner, the transit across the Atlantic was not a good time. There were no such things as Carnival cruise lines. Nobody took a cruise for vacation. It was to get from one place to another, and travel was awful. The boats were small, they leaked, they creaked, they were at the mercy of the winds or the lack of winds, and crossing was not a good time. Her family moved to the Philadelphia area with the immigrant's typical dream of a new life, opportunity, land, and a decent Philly cheesesteak. She moved to an area outside of Philadelphia. She married. Her husband was a tradesman. He was good with his hands. Washington and his entourage were entertained at the Rice home. Anthony Wayne's light infantry camped in their fields. And when Washington put the army into Valley Forge, some 2,500 men died of wounds or disease at Valley Forge. He decided the best thing to do was to separate the ill from the well and established a military hospital in Yellow Springs. Abigail's husband helped build the hospital, and she volunteered as a nurse. She started off just, well, I'll bring them a few things. Some nice things to make the soldiers feel better in the hospital, and the next thing you know, she found herself being one of the leading nurses on the staff. One of the problems for the nurses, though, aside from the conditions, was they were supposed to get paid. Well, if you think Congress had a lack of interest in paying the soldiers, they had less than a lack of interest in paying the women. And so Abigail and some of her non-fellow nurses organized a strike. They petitioned the Army, they petitioned Congress, they eventually won their suit, and they were paid equal with the men. Now, I'd like to tell you this had a happy ending. Unfortunately, in 1781, Abigail contracted typhoid fever from one of the soldiers, and in 1789, she died from the disease. Her gravestone says, "Some women have some children, some have none. Here lies the mother of 21. I'll just let that sink in. A little closer to home, Sybil Ludington, the female Paul Revere. So it's April of 1777. There's a supply depot and a military hospital in Danbury. The supply depot in particular is functioning much too well for the likes of British General Tryon, who's operating out of New York City. He puts together a raid. They land in Westport. They go up through Reading. They reach Danbury, and they besiege the town. They burn the stores and burn the hospital. When the alarm goes out, it goes over the border into New York State to the home of Colonel Ludington of the New York State Militia. He has a 16-year-old daughter who, if you believe this panel, her name is Sybil, and she volunteers to raise the alarm and bring the 470 soldiers of her father's regiment to their home so that they can come to the relief of Danbury. She rode 40 miles. And by the time she was done at dawn, some 420 of the 470 men had already gathered at her father's house on the basis of her riding to raise the alarm. Now, they got to Danbury too late to save Danbury, but they got to Ridgefield in time to cut off the British from being able to retreat through New York. So I got to ask you, is it fair that Paul Revere, who did not complete his ride and who got caught, he gets a poem? Sybil does not get a poem. In fact, her story disappears until the 1880s. And the story of her successful ride came back to the attention of the public. So since then, she's been commemorated with road markers along the route of her historic ride. Those went up in 1935. She got a statue in 1961. She became a postage stamp in 1974, and starting in 1979, the Sybil Ludington 50K run that approximates her route marker starting in Carmel, New York, and finishing at her statue in Lake Lenida. Now, here's a fun fact about Paul Revere. He participated as a commanding officer, a high-ranking officer, in one of the worst disasters in U.S. military and naval history. The raid on Castine, Maine on Penobscot Bay. It should have been a very simple operation. The British had a very small garrison on George Island, and the Americans had overwhelming force. But they believed they were outnumbered, and they believed that they were in danger from the British Navy. During this operation, Paul Revere behaved very badly. He was more concerned about his own comfort and his own safety than he was about the well-being and safety of his men, the men under his command, and those participating in the overall action. One of the officers over him was a general of the New York State Militia by the name of Peleg Wadsworth. Wadsworth despised Paul Revere. In fact, he brought him up on court-martial charges for dereliction of duty and cowardice. Now, Revere was acquitted, but Wadsworth went to his grave hating Paul Revere. So imagine poor Peleg spinning in his grave when some years later, in an attempt to try and hold the Union together, his grandnephew, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, pens the ride of Paul Revere, extolling the virtues of a man that his great-granduncle despised. Now, Deborah Sampson is probably one of the best documented but least known women of the American Revolution. And when I say women, with this segment of Women Under Fire, we're going to be talking about women who fought as men, disguised as men. Now, I am descended from Old Testament people, so when I see a name like Deborah and Sampson, it raises my Old Testament interest. So here's what we've got. Deborah was the only female judge and the last judge during the period of judges before kings ruled Israel. They had both civil and military control, and apparently she was quite adept at both. She proved to be an active and fair civil administrator, and militarily, she put the wood to the Canaanites. Fun fact, her name translates as bee, as in Samantha Bee, for those who get to stay up late on Wednesday nights. Samson, we all know from the movie, there's a guy who should never have trusted anybody with scissors. He was known for his great physical strength, but couldn't keep a secret. But he pulled down the pillars and smote his enemies. And so, we remember him for that and being played by Victor Mature. So now we have Deborah Sampson. Born in 1760, when she was very young, her father ran away from home. He went out for a pack of cigarettes, apparently, and never came back. Because her family couldn't afford to feed everybody, she was put out to indenture. But she was fortunate in the family that she was indentured to, over time, really began to think of her as a member of the family rather than a servant. So she was educated with the other members of the family. She became a teacher. She taught until she was 21. Now, Massachusetts, by the end of the war, was having trouble filling its allotment of levies for the Continental Army. Deborah decided she wanted to do something other than be Deborah. So she borrowed some men's clothing. She went to the local enlisting office and signed up and took a bounty to serve in the Army as a man. But apparently, one of the women who happened to be at the enlisting place recognized her handwriting in the way she held a pen. Deborah found out, and when it became time for her to report, she did not. She was found out. She was brought to the authorities. She returned the bounty. She apologized, and nothing further was made of it. The following year, she decided she still wanted to be an active participant in the revolution. So she, again, took to men's clothing, went to an enlisting place farther away, and this time successfully enlisted as Robert Shirtliff. She joined the 4th Massachusetts Regiment Continental Line, the regular army, and eventually was posted to the Light Infantry Company. Now, the Light Infantry were the elite troops of the American Army. Don't tell that to the dragoons. You might have an argument. But the light troops, these were soldiers who were capable of acting independently, able to think on their own, be aggressive towards the enemy without being foolish. These were superb soldiers. So for her to have been posted to the Light Infantry Company meant that she herself was a cut above the average soldier. She was wounded 3 times. Her company was posted to the Westchester frontier. On one occasion, she recognized somebody from home who was a loyalist. Fortunately, he did not recognize her. She was wounded once by a saber cut to the head. On another occasion, she took 2 musket balls to the leg. She was brought to the surgeon's tent, realizing that if the surgeon got too close, he would realize that he was not a she, or she was not a he, rather. And so she slipped out of the surgeon's tent, but she purloined a scalpel on the way. She found herself a solitary location, and mind you, there's no anesthesia, there's no ether, there's no morphine. The best you had was laudanum, but she did not have access to that. There was no Novocaine. So she bit on a stick or bit on a bullet and took the bullet out of her leg. The second one she was not able to remove. It stayed with her for the rest of her life and left her with a limp. It wasn't until she contracted a fever that she was taken to the surgeon, and it was at that point that the doctor realized that this soldier had some stuff he shouldn't have and didn't have some stuff he should. But rather than report him and have Deborah kicked out of the Army, he made her part of his staff. But he did have to report to his commanding general, General Patterson, and when Patterson found out, he also did not force her to leave. He took her into his military family, and she served as part of his staff through the end of the war. At the end of the war, she received a pension. And in 1982, she became the official Massachusetts state heroine. A statue honoring her was dedicated in 1989 in the town of Sharon, Massachusetts, where she and her husband made their home till the end of their lives. But now it's 1804. Deborah, with the help of a professional writer, has put together the first tour of speaking engagements by a woman in American history. She started off dressed as a soldier, wearing her light infantry uniform, wearing her accoutrements, and handling her musket. She would go through the drill, and as she progressed, telling her story, she would gradually change from the garb of a soldier into the garb of a woman until she stood before the audience once again as Deborah Sampson. Anamaria Lane was another woman who served in men's clothing. Originally from Connecticut, she and her husband enlisted. They served with an artillery company. She was wounded at the Battle of Germantown in 1777, and afterwards her husband transferred to the Virginia Dragoons. She followed him, not in the service, but to Virginia. They had a long and happy life, fortunately, and she was granted a pension in 1808, the only woman of the American Revolution to be granted a pension by the state of Virginia. Sally St. Clair, there's no known image of her. She's believed to be of Creole origin. She also dressed as a man to follow her significant other into battle. They were serving in the battle with an artillery company, Proctor's 4th Artillery, at the Battle of Savannah. They were both killed the same day. He first, her later on, and her true gender was not discovered until after her death. This is believed to be the last major action of the American Revolution. Elizabeth Zane, although she lived in what was then Fort Henry, now Wheeling, West Virginia, she was no rube. She was college educated. She went to college in Philadelphia. She came home just in time to be in now Wheeling, West Virginia, when a siege was laid by Native Americans and Loyalist Rangers. They were greatly outnumbered. One of the advantages they did have was they had a cannon mounted on the blockhouse in the middle of the fort that they were able to use to fire at the Indians and Rangers. It was so effective that the enemy forces decided, well, that's working for them, maybe we should try something similar. But lacking a cannon, they cut down a tree and hollowed it out, wrapped it in chains to keep it from exploding, and used it as a cannon. It exploded the first time they tried it, killing the entire crew and some of the individuals in the immediate vicinity. So they decided they were not going to do that again. They tried something else. And this is something you've probably seen in 1,000 movies involving white guys and Native Americans. The Indians come out, there's a few of them, and they're like, "Ooh, white guys, we're just a couple of stupid Indians. Come chase us and kill us." and they run off, and the white guys chase after them, and the next thing you know, there's an ambush. Well, the way they pulled this one off was they set fire to the cornfield adjacent to the fort. The white guys went out and chased them. They got ambushed, and now instead of having 40 musket men, they were down to 20. Also, now they're running out of gunpowder. Not all the gunpowder was in the fort. The rest of it was in the Zane cabin, which is about 50 yards from the post. Now, to give them their due, Betty's brothers volunteered to go get the gunpowder. But Betty said, "You have not one man to spare. A woman will not be missed in the defense of the fort. 'Tis better a maid than a man should die." So Betty takes herself and her apron, and she comes out of the fort, and she goes sauntering over to the cabin, and the Indians figure, white woman, she no bother us, and they left her alone. She got to the cabin, she filled her apron with gunpowder, and now made a dash back towards the fort. Now the Indians are firing at her with guns and arrows. Fortunately, they missed. She got into the fort, and they were able to hold out until relief arrived. Now, being able to hold out like that is a pretty big deal. What Betty did was a huge deal, but all she gets is like an honorable mention at the bottom of this roadside marker. I guess guys wrote it, huh? Okay, Molle Pitcher. Tons of images of Molle Pitcher. We've got 7 of them here, another 6 here, scads here, more. She's been a comic book, she's been an album, she's been a bas-relief, she's been a brand of beer, a postage stamp, a bobblehead doll, and a service area on the New Jersey Turnpike. Thing is, Molle never existed. First off, Molle was a term of art for a woman if you didn't know her name. You know, women who worked in taverns, they'd call them Mollies. Like the Australians, they refer to women as Sheilas. Or hepcats in the 50s called women chicks. Well, Molle was just another term for a woman. And Pitcher, of course, because of bringing water, and there are 2 instances where that happened. So we have a couple of different candidates for Molle Pitcher, but Molle Pitcher as an individual really was not a real thing. So the first was Margaret Corbin. Again, a woman attached to an artillerist. Now, what's happened in the Revolution is George Washington has had his forces kicked off of Long Island, and he's now being pushed up Manhattan Island. She and her husband are at Fort Washington manning an artillery piece. He goes down. She takes his place. She's hit by British ordnance, be it shrapnel or grape shot. She's wounded in the arm and breast. Fort Washington falls, and she is taken as a POW. When she's released, she's assigned to the Invalid Corps at West Point. And when she's released, she's given one complete set of clothes out of the public stores. Now, here's the thing. British did not take women as POWs. And women were not assigned to the Invalid Corps. And since the public stores only contained men's clothing, if she received clothing from the public stores, it was clothing for men. Which forensically thinking indicates that this entire time, she had dressed and disguised herself as a man. And so successfully that she was able to go through all these permutations and not be discovered. Now here's her monument at Fort Tryon, that's on the left. Her Military Academy Memorial at West Point is on the right, and a contemporary image of Fort Washington in the center. Fort Tryon Park comes out of part of what had been Fort Washington. It was created by John D. Rockefeller, who built the cloisters, created Fort Tryon Park, and then turned it back over to the city of New York. For the life of me, I can't figure out why an American like John D. Rockefeller would name a park for a royal governor and British general. Doesn't sound very patriotic to me. The other candidate is Mary Ludwig Hayes. Hers is the typical image of loading the cannon at the Battle of Monmouth in 1778. The end of June 1778 was beastly hot. Aside from having to worry about getting hit by things, it was so hot that men were not just passing out, but some men were dying from heat exhaustion. Don't forget, they're all buttoned up in wool coats with neck stocks, all the stuff hanging off them, all the heat pockets building up between the cross belts. Men were dying from the heat. So when Mary Ludwig Hayes, when her husband went down, she took his place loading the gun. At one point, she was reaching for a cartridge when a British cannonball passed between her legs and tore off the lower part of her skirt. Her only remark was, "Good thing it didn't go any higher, or it might have taken something else away." And she went back to servicing the cannon. Now, it'd be nice to say that her story has a happy ending, but her husband died, she remarried, and her husband was a louse. She wound up having to sell off almost all of the land bounty that she received for her wartime service for the sum of $30. She finished off her life by hiring herself out as a servant for hire. She was well loved in the neighborhood despite her fact of swearing like an artillerist. Now, while there may not have been a Molle Pitcher, there was a Molle Pitcher. So if you've got your tinfoil hat with you, it might be time to put it on, because this is where it gets all woo-woo. Molle Pitcher was born Molle Diamond. She was born in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and she is not the first of her family to exhibit paranormal abilities. Her grandfather, Edward Wizard Diamond, had a certain reputation. He was known to stand in the graveyards and being able to reach out to ships lost at sea and bring them home. And he had certain other psychic abilities that were well known in the community. It's a good thing that he and his granddaughter were not born during the time of the witch trials, or they would have been ducked or pressed or hung. Now, it seemed to have skipped a generation. Molle Diamond became Molle Pitcher when she married. She was a contemporary of General John Glover. Now, John Glover was a fisherman, but he also had military abilities, and it was he and the Marblehead fishermen who pulled off the American Dunkirk by taking Washington's troops off of Long Island. Now, Molle, her psychic abilities were a little different. She was adept at, and I love this word, I learned a new word, tasseography. It's the art of reading tea leaves. And she was also so good at it, she was able to predict the outcome of voyages before the ships even left port. She was so accurate that sailors would not leave until they got in the okie dokie from Molle Pitcher. This did not make ship owners and ship captains very happy, but presumably a lot of sailors' lives were saved in the process. Now, her abilities came to the attention of treasure seekers. They would come to her and say, "Where's the treasure buried?" And she'd say, "If I knew, would I tell you?" She was brought to the attention of British generals like General Gage and General Burgoyne. They would consult with her, but she was so shrewd that oftentimes she got more information out of them than they got out of her. So, meanwhile, 1775, Washington goes to Boston to assume command of the army. John Glover is one of his officers. Glover says to Washington, I know this woman that you really should talk to. So he brings Molle Pitcher to meet General Washington. Among her predictions, as you can see, is the outcome of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the success of the Revolution, the rise of Washington to national civilian leadership, space flight, horseless carriages, and for all I know, going back to that first panel, she could have predicted cell phones, which is why Washington has asked you to turn them off. Now, unfortunately, John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a 90-stanza poem saying horrible things about Molle Pitcher. That she was a hunchback, she had a limp, she was ugly, she consorted with the agents of sin. None of this stuff was true. In fact, Whittier, in later years, came to back off from the things he had written about her. In the late 1800s, her grave was marked with a stone that read that she was attractive and of good form and agreeable manners. In 1855, a play entitled Molle Pitcher, or The Fortune Teller of Lynn, by Joseph Stephen Jones, debuted and ran on the stage in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. And on October 5th, 2013, the Lynn Museum in Lynn, Massachusetts, declared Molle Pitcher Day and held psychic readings in her honor. So she's fortunate that she lived in a parenthetical era between the witch hysteria of the late 1600s and the spiritualism craze of the late 1800s. In her own time, she was respected for her gifts and her personality and the enduring legacy of the accuracy of her predictions. Now, women also served as spies. And of course, I couldn't resist the opportunity to bring out my favorite woman spy, Natasha Fatale, known to us fans from Rocky and Bullwinkle. Now, I'm going to be doing another segment on espionage, so I'm not going to go in depth on this one. But I'm going to talk about a woman with connections to Connecticut who served in the espionage field. And that's Anna Strong of the Culper Spy Ring. For those who watched the AMC series Turn, that revolves around the Culper Ring and its activities from 1778 through the end of the war. The Connecticut connection comes because, well, one, it was headed by Major Benjamin Talmadge, executive officer of the 2nd Continental Light Dragoons, and a Connecticut resident. Now, he was originally from Long Island, but he moved to Connecticut to go to Yale, and he stayed in Connecticut. And Talmadge, in fact, was the second to last man to leave Long Island during that withdrawal. He served with Washington almost from the beginning of the war. The other Connecticut connection was Caleb Brewster, also originally from Long Island and transplanted to Connecticut. He operated, well, his home still stands in the Black Rock section of Bridgeport, which was once part of Fairfield. Anna Strong and her husband operated a tavern on the north shore of Long Island. Her husband was taken prisoner of war by the British. He was sent to a prison hulk. His health deteriorated. Fortunately, they were able to get him released, and he was sent to Connecticut to recuperate. They both survived the war. But here's what among the things that Anna did. There's a series of coves on the north shore of Long Island near Setauket. And the Culper Ring operated throughout Long Island and in New York City. Information would be gathered. It would be brought back to Setauket, to the tavern where Anna Strong was, and then deposited at one of the coves. In order to tell Caleb Brewster what cove to go to get this information, she would hang laundry. And depending on the laundry she hung, the color, the type, and size, this code would tell Caleb Brewster where to go to get the information, which he would then bring back to Connecticut to Talmadge. Talmadge would consult with Washington, and then actions would be designed and carried out on the basis of that. I'm happy to say, as I mentioned earlier, she and her husband both survived the war. They had kids. They had a very happy life until it stopped. This is one of my favorite stories. Nancy Morgan Hart. The object lesson here is you do not mess around with Nancy Morgan Hart. Now, there's some question about where she was born, but she wound up with her husband in South Carolina. She was a quintessential frontier woman. Now, it is said she was homely. It is said that if she ever looked in a mirror, she would not like what she saw, be that as it may. She was rugged, she was independent, she ruled her family, she was loyal to her family and friends. She was an herbalist, a midwife, and while she may have been illiterate, she knew her way around a firearm. She would often go out to the river crossings with her husband and their militia unit and take pot shots, picking off British and loyalists as they tried to cross the river, because you do not mess around with Nancy Morgan Hart. So, one day, her husband is off with the militia doing militia stuff, and she's home with their 2 children. 6 British soldiers show up, invade her home, and demand that she go out into the farmyard, take one of the turkeys, cook them dinner, and provide them with food and drink. Well, it's just her and the 2 kids, 6 armed British soldiers. What's she going to do? She did what they asked. So she cooked the food. They're sitting. The 6 soldiers are sitting. They're eating. They're drinking. They're eating. They're drinking. They're drinking. They're drinking. They're drinking. And while all this is going on, Nancy Morgan Hart is taking their loaded muskets and passing them out the window to her 2 children. She's got 4 of them out the window when one of the British soldiers jumps up and runs at her. She grabs one of the loaded muskets, aims it at him, and shoots him dead. A second soldier, not taking the object lesson to heart, comes at her. She grabs the second loaded musket at her disposal and shoots him dead as well. One of the kids passes her a third loaded musket, and now she's got the other 4 held at bay. And she holds them at gunpoint till her husband comes home with the militia. Well, what are they going to do? Her husband says they're prisoners of war. We're going to take them out and shoot them. And Nancy Morgan Hart says, no, they did this, they did this, they did this. Hang them. Husband says, and the militia guys say, no, that's not an honorable way for a soldier to die. They should be shot. Nancy Morgan Hart says, no, I want them hung. And have I mentioned you don't mess around with Nancy Morgan Hart? So they took these 4 out, they found a tree, and they strung them up by their necks. This is family lore, told from one generation to the next of the Hart family, until 1912. Now, this is the part, if this was a 1930s or 1940s movie, all those calendar pages, all the date pages come flying off the wall. It's now 1912. Railroad workers are digging a new railroad cut for a railroad line about a mile from where the Hart cabin had been located. They find 6 bodies. 2 of them have lead balls lodged in them, and 4 of them have their necks broken as if they had been hung. And so family lore becomes history. This story is a little more sedate. Mrs. Mary Lindley Murray. The Murray family is where you get the Murray Hill section of New York. And if you're old enough to remember Gimbel's Shop at Home reupholstery service, just call Murray Hill 77500. So we're back to Washington being shoved up out of Manhattan. There's a British column headed up the island, and on the west shore of Manhattan, along the west coast of Manhattan, is a column of American soldiers under Connecticut's own General Israel Putnam. They are in danger of being cut off by this British column, until the British get to the home of Mary Lindley Murray. Now, she was a nice Quaker lady from the Philadelphia area. She married a well-to-do merchant who happened to be of the Loyalist persuasion. But in any event, they moved to New York, and he became even more successful. And he must have been out doing business stuff the day this happened, because as the British came up the road, Mrs. Murray said, "Oh, you poor British soldiers in your hot uniforms. Ooh, would you not like to stop and pause for some cool refreshment?" And the officers said, "Yeah, sure." And Mrs. Murray was very attractive and very charming, and so they had a very pleasant afternoon of tea and crumpets or whatever. Meanwhile, the soldiers are still standing in formation, probably at shoulders arms, in their wool uniforms, all buttoned up with their neck stocks and their felt hats. In any event, it gave Putnam's column enough of an opportunity to escape being captured by the British and rejoin Washington in time for later on the Battle of White Plains. And this is our last story, and I have to confess, my favorite, the sisters-in-law Martin. This takes place down in Georgia. The Martin family had 9 sons. 7 of them served the revolutionary cause. The other 2 did not because they were too little to join the army. The 2 oldest sons were married to Rachel and Grace. They get word one day that there's going to be this good chance that there's going to be this trio of British riders coming through, a messenger and 2 men as escort. And in fact, they ride right past the Martin house. Rachel and Grace, by this time, are tired of rolling cartridges and bandages and making socks and gloves for the soldiers. They want to do something a little more proactive. So they borrow some of their husbands' clothing, disguise themselves as men, grab some pistols and 2 horses, and because they know the country, they know where the shortcuts are, they have a pretty good idea of the route the British are going to be taking with the messages, and so they ride ahead and set up an ambush. Sure enough, a short time later, these 3 British riders come riding along. Rachel and Grace, disguised as men, jump out of the bushes, brandishing their firearms, and force the 3 to halt. They took the dispatches and the British soldiers' guns, got back on their horses, and rode away. Again, knowing where the shortcuts are, they got home very quickly. They turned the messages over to a local dispatch rider who was able to get that information off to the area militia. Meanwhile, they have now changed back into their regular everyday women's clothing. A short while later, who is it? It's these 3 British soldiers. The mother says, "Didn't you ride by just a little while ago?" Yeah, that was us." "Well, what happened? Why are you back so soon?" Well, we got waylaid by these 2 guys, and they took our dispatch." "Well, didn't you have guns?" Well, they took them from us. And so, for the rest of the evening, I mean, all these three guys want is some food and a place to sleep so they can be on their way the next morning. But before they're given food and allowed to sleep in the barn, they are subjected to at least a couple of hours of humiliation at the hands of these three women. The next morning they leave, never knowing that the two men that had ambushed them are two of the women who had entertained them the evening before. Now that brings us to the end of the presentation. Usually I like to say something ennobling and pithy and something you can take away humming the tune and singing the words at the end of the talk, but in all honesty, the things that these women have done during the course of the American War for Independence speaks more loudly and largely than anything I could say. So thank you very much, and I will entertain questions. Yes, Terry.
So the Sybil Ludington story and commemoration, what individual or group of individuals was responsible for revivifying her story?
It's a combination of the DAR. The DAR really came into existence in this part of the world in the 1880s. And also the local historical societies and writings within the Ludington family. Next. That's it? Everybody's enlarged and ennobled? Okay, well, thanks for coming. And I know I'll be seeing some of you guys some other time in some other place.